All right, strap in everyone, because today we are going deep on Bitcoin. Specifically, we're going to figure out why some experts are predicting this perfect storm that could really send the price of Bitcoin through the roof. We've got a ton of research lined up for you today. Market analysis, political commentary, even some global economic forecasts. Seems like a lot, I know, but don't worry, we're going to break it all down.
Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it? What's fascinating here is how these different factors, the US election, the Federal Reserve, and China's economic plans, at first glance, they seem totally unrelated. But they're all kind of converging right now, and that could have a huge impact on Bitcoin.
Okay, so let's start with the election then. We've got Donald Trump back in the race,
Yeah.
and he's been making some pretty bold claims about Bitcoin. He's even talking about this U.S. Bitcoin strategic reserve. Can you explain what that would even mean?
Well, it's all about the US being a leader in digital assets, like countries hold gold reserves. It's like that having a strategic reserve of Bitcoin would signal a strong commitment. And that commitment could influence other countries to follow suit.
So it's not just the U.S. adopting Bitcoin, it's about encouraging global adoption.
Exactly. And that increased demand would definitely affect the price. Trump's also talked about tackling national debt with Bitcoin, which is, well, that's a lot more complex. And to be honest, a much more controversial idea.
I can imagine. Are there any potential positives there? And what about the negatives?
Okay, well, on the one hand, if the US started settling debt with Bitcoin, it would create a huge demand. And that would send a massive signal to other countries, especially those struggling with debt, right? But on the other hand, it could destabilize the US dollar. I mean, the dollar is the world's reserve currency. And honestly, it's not even clear how feasible that is, with Bitcoin being as volatile as it is.
So there are a lot of unknowns when it comes to Trump's Bitcoin ideas. What about the other candidate? What do they think about Bitcoin?
Well, that's where things get a little murky, I guess. Their position isn't really clear, so it just adds another layer of uncertainty to all of this. Depending on who wins, Bitcoin regulation in the US could look very different.
And that would have ripple effects across the globe for sure.
Hmm.
So we've got a potential shakeup coming from the election, but then there's also the Fed, right? They've been cutting interest rates. How does that play into this perfect storm we're talking about?
It's all about liquidity. When the Fed cuts rates, it basically becomes cheaper to borrow money. That puts more money into the system, and investors start looking for assets with higher yields. In that environment, Bitcoin, with its growth potential, starts to look very appealing.
So it's not that Bitcoin is becoming more attractive necessarily,
Yeah.
but more that traditional investments become less attractive when interest rates are low.
Exactly, exactly. And this is where the decentralized nature of Bitcoin really shines. Unlike stocks or bonds, Bitcoin doesn't depend on central banks. For investors who are worried about the economy, that can be really appealing.
So it's like Bitcoin gives people a sense of control, you know, when everything else feels so uncertain.
That's a great way to put it. And it's not just regular investors who are noticing this, by the way. We're seeing more and more interest from institutional investors, too, which, of course, just adds to the demand.
Okay, so the election could change regulation, and the Fed's actions make Bitcoin look better. But then there's this third element, China. What's going on in China, and how does that connect to Bitcoin?
So China is having some economic issues of their own, and they're planning some huge, and I mean huge, stimulus packages to try to fix things. We're talking potentially over $1.4 trillion. dollars.
Wow, okay, that's a staggering amount of money, but I still don't see how that helps Bitcoin.
Okay, well, think about it this way. When you put that much money into the global economy, it almost always causes inflation. And as we already said, Bitcoin is often seen as a hedge against inflation. So some analysts think the stimulus, combined with what the Fed is doing, they think it could be the perfect recipe for a Bitcoin bull run.
So it's like all these different things, they're all kind of pushing Bitcoin upwards.
That's basically the perfect storm scenario. You've got these three major players, all acting in their own self-interest, but their actions create this unique situation that could be incredibly beneficial for Bitcoin.
But with all this potential for a boom, there have to be some risks too, right?
Hmm.
Could this perfect storm actually end up hurting Bitcoin?
Oh, absolutely. There are always risks, especially with something as volatile as Bitcoin. For example, what if China's stimulus plan doesn't work?
You mean their economy doesn't recover as quickly as they want?
Right. And if that happens, it could really damage the positive sentiment around Bitcoin. And then there's the whole regulatory landscape, which is still very much up in the air.
Right, because even if the economy is perfect for Bitcoin, a sudden crackdown from regulators could ruin everything.
Exactly. And we can't forget about Bitcoin's own volatility. Even if everything else lines up perfectly, the price could still suddenly correct.
So it's like walking through a minefield, even with a map.
That's a perfect analogy. There's potential for huge rewards, but you need to understand the risks and be extremely careful.
Okay, so we've laid out the basics of this perfect storm forming around Bitcoin. But what does it mean for the average person? Should they buy Bitcoin right now?
That's a great question. And it's one that we're going to explore in much more detail in the next part of our deep dive. We'll break down the potential consequences, both good and bad, and talk about what you should be thinking about as an investor.
Sounds good. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back to continue unpacking all of this.
Welcome back, everyone. So we've been talking about this perfect storm forming around Bitcoin. Now let's really dig into what a potential Bitcoin boom would actually mean for you.
Okay, so let's just say these predictions all come true. Bitcoin's price goes way up, like explodes. What kind of impact are we talking about here? Could this actually change people's lives financially?
It definitely has that potential. Yeah, remember, Bitcoin's supply is capped. There will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin. So when you have increased demand from investors, institutions, maybe even governments, well, the price could really skyrocket, some analysts believe. That we could see Bitcoin reach many times its previous all-time highs.
Okay, that's exciting and all, but let's be real for a second. What about the potential downsides? I mean, Bitcoin is famous for its volatility.
You're absolutely right. Volatility is a major factor. Even if this perfect storm pushes Bitcoin to new highs, it's almost guaranteed that there will be big price swings along the way. This is not an investment for someone who's risk averse.
So even if the price goes up over time, it's going to be a bumpy ride. What else should people keep in mind?
Well, regulatory uncertainty is a big one. Governments are still trying to figure out what to do about Bitcoin, and any sudden changes in regulations could have a massive impact on the market.
It's like this perfect storm is happening while the ground is still shifting under our feet.
Exactly. And those shifting sands, as you put it, make it really tough to predict the long-term outcome.
Yeah.
But let's shift gears for a minute and talk about traditional financial systems.
Okay, this is where it gets interesting for me. What happens when a decentralized digital currency, like Bitcoin, starts to gain real traction? Does that threaten the way things are now?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? A lot of economists and policymakers are wrestling with that right now. Some people definitely see Bitcoin as a threat to central banks and fiat currencies.
So it's not just about Bitcoin's price going up. It's a fundamental shift in how we think about money, maybe even a challenge to the whole system.
That's exactly right. Bitcoin is decentralized, has a fixed supply, and it's independent from governments. All of that challenges the tools central banks use to manage the economy.
It's like Bitcoin is this disruptive force, pushing the boundaries of what's possible in finance.
I like that. It's a really good way to think about it. And that disruption can be exciting and also kind of scary. One area where this disruption could be felt is inflation. As the Fed keeps pumping money into the economy, it could lead to a devaluation of the US dollar.
So the more dollars there are, the less each one is worth.
Exactly. And that means the prices of things go up. Now, Bitcoin supporters will tell you that it's a hedge against inflation.
Because its supply is limited. So it won't be affected by inflation in the same way that the dollar is.
That's the thinking, yeah. And as more people get concerned about inflation, they might turn to Bitcoin to protect their purchasing power.
So in a way, this perfect storm could actually be good for Bitcoin because it makes it seem like a better alternative to traditional currencies.
It's definitely possible, but it's important to remember this is all just speculation. No one knows for sure how Bitcoin will behave if we have high inflation.
Okay, so potential benefits, but we need to be realistic too. What about the impact on global trade? What about China's stimulus plan?
Well, China's actions are going to affect economies around the world, and as those economies adapt, we could see more volatility in currency markets.
And in that kind of volatile environment, could Bitcoin be seen as a more stable option?
Potentially, yes. Especially if people start losing faith in traditional currencies. The fact that Bitcoin is decentralized and separate from governments could make it more appealing for international transactions.
So instead of relying on the dollar for global trade,
hmm
we might see a shift toward Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies.
It's possible, yeah. But it's important to remember that Bitcoin is still a small part of the global financial system. It's not going to replace the US dollar overnight.
Right, but this perfect storm could speed up Bitcoin's adoption and maybe set the stage for it to play a bigger role in the future.
Exactly. It's like this perfect storm is shaking everything up. It's creating opportunities for new players like Bitcoin to emerge and challenge the way things are.
And those challenges could lead to some really big changes in how we think about money and finance.
Absolutely. This whole thing is still unfolding, and we don't know how it will end. But it's a fascinating example of how new technologies can disrupt old systems.
Yeah, it really does feel like we're watching history happen. But we've covered so much already, and I feel like there's still more to talk about. What about the long-term implications of this perfect storm?
That's a great question, and one we're going to dive into in the last part of our deep dive. We'll explore the potential long-term impact of all of this on both Bitcoin and the entire financial system.
Sounds good. Stay tuned, everyone. We'll be right back to wrap things up and explore what the future might hold for Bitcoin. All right, we're back and ready to wrap up our Bitcoin deep dive. We've talked about this perfect storm, how it could drive the price of Bitcoin way up, and maybe even change the way our financial systems work. But now I want to look ahead, like, what could this all mean in the long run?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? The million-dollar question. One really interesting possibility is that Bitcoin becomes a true global reserve asset.
Okay, what would that even look like? Help me picture that.
Imagine a world, right, where everyone, individuals, companies, even countries, they all hold Bitcoin as their main store of value, kind of like how the US dollar is used today.
That's a pretty huge change.
Yeah.
How could this perfect storm actually make that happen?
Remember everything we've talked about, the US election, the Fed, China's economy, all of these things individually and together, they could lead to people trusting traditional finance less and less.
So it's not just that Bitcoin gets better, it's that the old system gets worse.
Exactly. People lose trust and they start looking for alternatives. And Bitcoin, well, it's decentralized, it works across borders. It could be seen as a more stable option when everything else is uncertain.
So Bitcoin is just waiting for the right moment, almost. Like it's ready to step in if the current system fails. But let's be real. Are there things holding Bitcoin back from becoming that global asset?
Oh, yeah, there are definitely challenges. One is scalability. Like we discussed earlier, the Bitcoin network needs to handle more transactions, a lot more, if it's going to be used by the whole world.
Right? It's like that small store suddenly needing to be a huge shopping mall.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's regulation. Governments will have a big impact on Bitcoin, one way or another. Will they support it, or will they try to shut it down? That's a big question.
So even if Bitcoin solves the technical problems, there's still the politics to deal with.
Absolutely. Another thing to think about is innovation. All this attention and money coming into Bitcoin. Well, it could lead to new technologies and applications being developed, things that make Bitcoin easier to use, more secure, more accessible.
So it's not just about Bitcoin as it is right now, but how it could change and improve.
Exactly. We could see tons of companies building on the Bitcoin blockchain, creating all sorts of new financial products and services that we can't even imagine yet.
It's like this perfect storm could be the spark. That ignites a ton of creativity in the Bitcoin world.
Yeah, and that innovation could cement Bitcoin's place as a leader in the future of finance. But like with any revolution, there will be obstacles.
So it's not going to be easy for Bitcoin. What are some of the things that could go wrong?
Well, one is volatility. Even if the price goes up in the long term, there will be ups and downs. Investors need to understand that and not freak out when the price drops.
Don't let your emotions make your investment decisions, right?
Exactly. Another big one is security. As Bitcoin becomes more valuable, it's a bigger target for hackers. Individuals and institutions need to be really careful and protect their Bitcoin.
So it's not a buy it and forget it kind of thing. You got to stay informed, be proactive, manage your risk.
You got it. And that brings us back to education. The more people learn about Bitcoin, the better decisions they can make.
All right, so wrapping up, what's the most important thing for our listeners to remember? What should they be doing as we watch this perfect storm play out?
I think the most important thing is to be curious, stay informed, and think critically.
Don't just believe everything you read online, right?
Right. Do your own research, talk to experts, come to your own conclusions.
Think of the future of Bitcoin. Well, it's still being written.
It's up to each of us to decide what role we want to play in that story.
Well said. And on that note, I think that wraps up our Bitcoin Perfect Storm deep dive. We hope you found it informative and maybe even a little exciting. Like always, we encourage you to keep learning, exploring, and diving deep into these topics. Until next time, stay curious.